Here's something that should probably bother more people than it does. The freight moves, the truck runs, the shelves get stocked, the warehouses turn over. The economy keeps doing its thing, and at the center of it all is a driver who, after a full week of doing exactly what the whole system depends on, sits down, does the math, and thinks, this isn't adding up. That's not a complaint. That's an accounting problem. And it's one trucking has been comfortable not solving for a very long time. Welcome back, drivers. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Jen, and this is my podcast, Behind the Wheel. I'm so glad you guys are here with me today. And today we're talking about freight rates. And I want to be clear up front that this is not going to be a dry market update. There are plenty of those type of videos out there. And if you're looking for a rate index or capacity projections, the internet definitely has you covered with those. What I do want to talk about is something those reports typically skip over, which is what the freight market actually feels like when you're the one living inside it. Because for a lot of drivers right now, the story the data tells and the story the week tells doesn't quite match up. And that gap between what the market supposedly looks like from the outside and what it feels like from the seat is exactly where this conversation needs to live. So that's where we're going to go with this conversation today. The freight market. Why drivers still feel squeezed, even when the headlines sound cautiously optimistic, and what the money side of this business actually reveals about who this system is really built around. All right, so the freight market right now it's a mess, if I'm being honest. I think that it's genuinely hard to read. And I think that confusion is part of the story. Because depending on which number you look at, you can build a pretty reasonable case that things are slowly getting better, and then flip to the next page and build an equally reasonable case that drivers have no business relaxing yet. Here's what things actually stand. In late February, that national dry van line haul spot rate, they were sitting around $2.04 a mile. Flatbeds were up about $2.21 a mile. And on the surface, year-over-year improvements sound like pretty good news. The problem is that better than a year still depends heavily on how bad a year ago was. Climbing out of a hole is real progress. It's just not the same thing as standing on solid ground. And the demand picture underneath those rate numbers doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Pace Freight reported that January 2026, shipments were down 7.1% compared to the prior year, meaning less freight actually moving through the system, even as some spot rates have ticked up. That kind of disconnect tends to make people nervous, and for good reason. It suggests the rate improvement may be more about reduced capacity than surging demand, which is a much shakier foundation for optimism. And this is where the cautious good news really starts to struggle. ARI's 2025 analysis put the average cost of operating a truck in 2024 at $2.26 per mile, which means that even when the rate line moves in the right direction, the cost line is chasing it. The gap between the two, which is where the actual money lives, hasn't opened up the way drivers need it to. That's the real headline today. Not that rates are up and not that things are terrible, but the market is in this uncomfortable in-between place where the numbers can look like improvement, while the lived experience still feels like a lot of pressure. Understanding why that gap exists is a lot more useful than celebrating a benchmark that hasn't actually translated into financial relief for the people running the trucks. Drivers, we typically feel the freight market the way a normal person probably feels the change in weather. It's not really through a measurement, but it's through the air. Owner-operators, it's not atmospheric at all. It's completely concrete. It's the truck payment coming around while the rate environment isn't cooperating. It's watching fuel prices move and knowing exactly what that does to the margin on the load you're already committed to. It's the mental math that never really stops, because when you're running your own operation, there's no separation between the business having a bad week and you having a bad week. For company drivers, the impact is a little less direct, but it's still very real. It's the inconsistent miles, the worse in load quality, a dispatch team operating under more pressure and passing that pressure downhill in the form of tighter expectations and less flexibility. One thing I do want to push back on in this episode is a phrase that you constantly hear during slow periods. Just keep the wheels turning, right? And a lot of drivers, that sounds like wisdom. And it sounds like the stoic, heads down attitude that built careers in this industry. But in a freight market like this, it can quietly become the thing that sinks you. A truck moving for money that doesn't make the math work isn't being productive. It's burning your fuel, it's burning your time, your maintenance budget is going out the window, and the driver, all in service of a load that shouldn't have been accepted in the first place. Movement for its own sake definitely has a cost. And trucking has a long tradition of celebrating the hustle without really asking whether the hustle is actually paying. The discipline that actually serves drivers in a down market is less about keep moving and more about staying clear-eyed, knowing what load actually costs when you factor in everything the gross rate ignores, like deadhead, delays, dock time, wear on equipment, and the reality that a time spent on a bad load is time not available for a better one. The math is unsexy. It doesn't make a great story. But it's the difference between drivers who come out of a soft cycle intact and drivers who come out of it exhausted and behind. And there's a bigger conversation underneath all of this that the industry typically avoids, which is about where the value in the freight chain is actually going. Because when you look at who absorbs the pressure during a down market, who takes on the rate cuts, who operates closer and closer to the edge of viability, it's almost always the driver. The broker will still make a margin. The shippers will still move their freights. The carrier still has their obligations to meet. But the driver, at the very end of that chain, is the one with the least leverage and the most exposure. That's not really a negotiating failure on the driver's part. It's more structural. And it's one of those truths about trucking that everyone kind of knows, and almost nobody in a position to change it seems particularly motivated to address. So here's the thing about freight rates that gets lost in the market analysis. They're not really a financial story. They're a human story with financial symptoms. When rates are strong, drivers, they have room. They have room to absorb a delay, room to pass on a bad load, room to plan a little further ahead than just tomorrow. That room is what makes the rest of the job manageable. It doesn't make the dock wait any shorter or the parking any easier, but it does make all of it way more survivable in a way that starts to feel like a reasonable trade. When that room disappears, everything else gets harder. Not just financially, but emotionally and mentally as well. Same delays that were annoying in a good market become genuinely demoralizing in a bad one. Stress compounds in ways that don't show up on a rate chart, but they do absolutely show up in the health, the relationships, and the longevity of the people running these trucks. That's the part the industry is most willing to overlook. Trucking tends to treat drivers' sustainability as more of a soft topic, something worth mentioning at a conference, but not something that actually shapes how the business gets structured. But driver sustainability is not soft. It's all operational. When experienced people burn out and leave, or when an owner-operator overextends trying to survive a down cycle and come out the other side unable to recover, when the mood in the industry settles into that particular brand of tired skepticism, that's really hard to shake. Those things have real consequences for how the whole machine runs. You just take long enough to show up that it's easy to pretend there's somebody else's problem. The deeper ask here isn't for the freight market to be something it isn't. Markets cycle, rates go up and down, and trucking is not exempt from that reality. The ask is for the industry to be honest about who absorbs the cost when these type of things go down. and whether that distribution is actually fair or just familiar. Because familiar and fair are definitely not the same thing. And trucking has been letting familiarity do the work for justification for a long time. Drivers aren't asking for a guaranteed perfect market. They're asking for a structure where the hard times are shared more evenly and the good times actually reach the seat. I mean, honestly, that's a pretty reasonable ask. The fact that it still feels like a radical one says a lot about where the industry's priorities actually sit. Not where it says they sit, but where they actually are. Revealed by who gets protected when things get tight and who gets asked to absorb it quietly and keep the wheels turning. That's the freight rate conversation worth having. Not the cents per mile, but the question underneath it. Is this system actually set up for the people running it to succeed? Honestly, until that question gets a better answer than it currently has, a lot of drivers are going to keep doing the math at the end of the week and landing in the same place. The truck ran, the freight moved, and somehow the numbers still don't quite add up. All right, drivers, so that's it for today's episode of Behind the Wheel. Again, I do appreciate all of you being here. If this particular topic resonated with you, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below. Also, like the video and leave a comment. Let me know how you're doing out there, whether it's where what's your 20, whether you're dealing with this freight market right now, if you're company or owner-operator. Let me know what your experiences are. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to start a conversation in the comments. With that being said, take care, drivers, and I will see you in the next episode.